Our Lady of the Flowers by Jean Genet, Part 19, page 253. Darling wandered from one department store to another. They were the only luxury he could approach at close range in which he could wallow. He was attracted by the elevator, the mirrors, the carpets, especially the carpets, which muted all the inner workings of the organs of his body. Silence entered him through his feet, padded the whole play of his mechanism. In short, he no longer felt himself. He was hardly at all attracted by the salesgirls, for inadvertently certain gestures, though very restrained, certain mannerisms of divine, escaped him. At first, he had dared a few just for the fun of it, but slyly, little by little, they were conquering the stronghold, and Darling did not even notice that he was shedding his skin. It was at a later time, and we shall tell how, that he realized the falseness of what he had blurted out one evening. "A male that fucks another male is a double male." Before going into Lafayette's department store, he unhooked the gold chain that was beating against his fly. As long as he was alone on the sidewalk, struggle was still possible, but in the meshes of all the low lanes that the counters and showcases wove into a shifting net, he was lost. He was at the mercy of the will of another, who stuffed his pockets with objects which, when he got to his room and put them on the table, he did not recognize. For the sign which made him choose at the moment of theft was hardly common to the divinity and Darling. At the moment of this taking possession by the other, from Darling's eyes, his ears, his slightly open and even closed mouth, there would flutter out with the flapping of tiny wings, little gray or red Mercuries with wings on their ankles. Darling the tough, the cold, the irrefragable, Darling the pimp would come to life. Like a steep rock from which, at each wet and mossy hollow, a brisk sparrow emerges, flitting about it like a flight of winged pricks. Sooner or later, he was bound to take a crack at it. That is, at stealing. He had on several occasions already engaged in the following game. On a showcase, among the objects on display, and in the most inaccessible spot, he would place, as if inadvertently, some trifling object that had been bought and duly paid for at a distant counter. He would let it lie there for a few minutes, ignoring its existence, and examine the surrounding displays. When the object had melted sufficiently into the rest of the display, he would steal it. Twice the store detective had caught him, and twice the management had been obliged to excuse itself, since Darling had the sales slip. Stealing from showcases is done in several ways, and perhaps each mode of display requires the use of one rather than another. For example, with one hand, you can take hold of two objects, small objects, wallets, at the same time. Hold them as if they were only one, examine them leisurely, slip one into your sleeve, and finally put the other back as if it were not quite what you wanted. In front of piles of silk remnants, you casually put one hand into the pocket, which is slit, of your overcoat. You approach the counter until your stomach touches it, and while your free hand is fingering the cloth, moving it about and throwing the silks into disorder, the hand which is in the pocket goes up to the top of the counter, still on a level with the navel, draws in the cutting at the bottom of the pile, and thus slides it, for it is supple, under the overcoat, which hides it. But I am giving recipes that all housewives and purchasers are familiar with. Darling preferred to seize, to make the object describe a prompt parabola from the display case to his pocket. It was bold, but more beautiful. Like falling stars, bottles of perfumes, pipes, lighters streamed in a pure, brief curve and swelled out his thighs. It was a dangerous game. Whether it was worth the effort, only Darling could tell. The game was a science that required training, preparation, like military science. You first had to study the layout of the mirrors and their bevels, and also the oblique ones hooked to the ceiling, which reflect you in an upside down world, but which the detectives, by a strange trick that functions in their brain, quickly turn right side up and orient correctly. You had to watch for the moment when the salesgirl's eyes were elsewhere, and when the customers, always traders, were not looking. Finally, you had to find like a lost object, or better, like one of those picture puzzle figures, the lines of which on dessert plates are also those of trees and clouds. The detective. Find the detective. It's a woman. The movies, among other games, teach a natural made up completely of artifices and 1,000 times more deceptive than the real. By dint of succeeding in resembling a delegate to a convention or a midwife, the movie detective has given to the faces of real delegates and real midwives the faces of detectives. And the real detectives, haggard amidst this disorder which mixes up faces, unable to put up with this any longer, have chosen to look like detectives, which simplifies nothing. A spy who looked like a spy would be a bad spy, a dancer said to me one day. One usually says, a dancer one evening. I don't believe it. Darling was about to leave the store. Having nothing better to do, and in order to seem natural, and also because it's hard to shake off that turbulence, a Brownian movement as dense and mobile and moving as morning torpor, he lingered as he passed to look at the displays, where one sees shirts, bottles of glue, hammers, toy lambs, rubber sponges. In his pockets were 2 silver lighters and a cigarette case. He was being followed. When he was near the door, which was guarded by a uniformed colossus, a little old woman said to him quietly, "What have you stolen, young man?" It was the young man that charmed Darling. Otherwise, he would have made a dash for it. The most innocent words are the most pernicious. They're the ones you have to watch out for. Almost immediately, the colossus was upon him and grabbed his wrist. He charged like a tremendous wave upon the bather asleep on the beach. Through the old woman's words and the man's gesture, a new universe instantaneously presented itself to Darling, the universe of the irremediable. It is the same as the one we were in, with one peculiar difference. Instead of acting and knowing we are acting, we know we are acted upon. A gaze, and it may be of your own eyes, has the sudden precise keenness of the extra lucid, and the order of this world, seen inside out, appears so perfect in its inevitability that this world has only to disappear. That's what it does in the twinkling of an eye. The world is turned inside out like a glove. It happens that I am the glove, and that I finally realize that on Judgment Day it will be with my own voice that God will call me. Jean, Jean. Darling had known too many, as many as I had, of these world's ends for him to lament in rebellion against this one when he regained his footing. A rebellion would have merely made him flip-flop like a carp on a carpet, and would have made him ridiculous. Submissively, as on a leash and in a dream, he let himself be taken by the doorman and the female detective to the office of the store's special police superintendent in the basement. He was done for, nabbed. That very evening, a police wagon took him to the station, where he spent the night with numerous tramps, beggars, thieves, pickpockets, pimps, forgers, people who had emerged from between the ill-joined stones of houses set up against each other in the darkest blind alleys. The following day, Darling and his companions were taken to the Fres prison. He then had to tell his name, his mother's name, and the given name, hitherto secret, of his father. He invented Romuald. He also gave his age and occupation. "Your occupation?" asked the court clerk. "Mine?" "Of course yours." Darling was on the point of seeing issue from between his blossoming lips. "Barmaid." But he answered, "No occupation. I don't work." However, these words had for Darling the meaning and value of barmaid. Finally, he was undressed and his clothes were searched, including the hems. The guard made him open his mouth, inspected it, ran his hands through Darling's thick hair, and furtively, after having mussed it over with his forehead, grazed the back of his neck, which was still hollow and warm and vibrant, sensitive and ready, at the slightest caress, to cause frightful damage. It is by the back of his neck that we see that Darling can still make a delicious trooper. Finally, the guard said to him, "Bend down." He bent. The guard looked at his anus and saw a black spot. "Yes!" he cried. Darling sneezed. But he had misunderstood. It was "squeeze" that the guard had cried. The black spot was rather a big lump of dung, which got bigger every day and which Darling had already several times tried to pull away, but he would have had to pull the hairs out with it or take a hot bath. "You've sure been shitting," said the guard. Now, to be shitting also meant to be scared, and the guard did not know this. Darling, of the noble bearing, of the swaying hips, of the motionless shoulders. At the reformatory, an inspector, he was 25 years old, and wore fawn-colored leather boots up to his thighs, which were no doubt hairy, had noticed that the youngster's shirt-tails were stained with shit. Every Sunday morning, when we changed linen, he therefore made us hold out our dirty shirts by the outspread sleeves. With the thin end of his whip, he would lash the face, already tortured by humiliation, of the boy whose shirt-tail was doubtful. We no longer dared to go to the toilet, but when we were driven to it by a case of the gripes, after wiping our fingers on the whitewashed wall, there was no paper, which was already yellow with piss, we took good care to lift up our shirt-tails. I now say we, but at that time each kid thought he was the only one who did it, and it was the seat of the white pants that was soiled. On Sunday mornings we felt the hypocritical purity of virgins. La Roche-Deux was the only one who, toward the end of the week, got tangled up in his shirt-tails and dirtied them. Though the matter was not serious, the 3 years that he spent in the penitentiary were poisoned by the preoccupation with those Sunday mornings, which I now see decorated with garlands of little shirts flowered with light touches of yellow shit, before Mass, with the result that on Saturday evenings he would rub the corner of his shirt on the whitewash of the wall to try to whiten it. Passing in front of him, the little boy drawn and quartered, already in the pillory, crucified at 15. The leather-booted inspector, his eyes tawny and gleaming, remained motionless. Without any preconceived cleverness on his part, there passed over his harsh features the feelings which we shall say were painted there because of that harshness like a charge: disgust, contempt, and horror. With his body erect, he spat right in La Roche-Deux's marble face, which awaited only this spit. We who read this can imagine that the inspector's shirt-tails and the seat of his underpants were shitty. Thus, darling Daintyfoot could divine the soul of a bum like La Roche-Deux on whose behind one spits. But he paid little attention to these momentary exchanges of souls. He never knew why. After certain shocks, he was surprised to find himself back in his skin. He did not say a word. The guard and he were alone in the locker room. His chest was bursting with fury, shame and fury. He left the room, trailing after him that noble behind, and it was by his behind that one could tell that he would have made a brilliant bullfighter. He was locked in a cell, and finally under lock and key. He felt free and washed. With his fragments glued together again, he was once more darling, gentle darling. His cell might be anywhere. The walls were white, the ceiling is white, but the filthy black floor sets it down on the floor and situates it there, precisely, that is, between 1,000 cells which crush it. Though they are light, on the 4th floor of the Fresnes prison. We are now there. The longest detours finally lead me back to my prison, to my cell. Now almost without trimmings, without transposition, without any intermediary, I could tell of my life here, my present life. In front of all the cells runs an inner balcony onto which each door opens. We stand behind our door, waiting for the guard, and fall into poses that identify us. For instance, a certain bum indicates, by standing with his cap in his extended hand, that he usually begs in front of churches. When he returns from the walk and waits for the guard, each prisoner, if he leans forward, cannot help hearing some guitar serenade or feel at this rail that the big vessel is lurching wildly beneath the moon and is about to go down. My cell is an exactly cubic box. In the evening, as soon as darling stretches out in bed, the window carries the cell off toward the west, detaches it from the masoned block, and flies off with it, holding it like the basket of a balloon. In the morning, if a door opens, they're all closed at that time, and this is a deep mystery, deep as the mystery of number in Mozart or the use of the chorus in tragedy. In prison, more doors are opened than closed. An elastic draws it back from the space in which it had been hovering and sets it in place again. That is, when the prisoner has to get up. He pisses, straight and solid as an elm, into the bowl of the latrine, then gives his limp tool a shake or two. The relief that comes from the flowing urine restores him to active life, places him on earth, though delicately, carefully, unties the bonds of night, and he gets dressed. With the whisk broom, he sweeps up ashes and dust. The guard comes by, opening the doors for 5 seconds to give the men time to put out the sweepings. Then he shuts them again. The prisoner is not quite over the nausea that comes from waking with a start. His mouth is full of pebbles. The bed is still warm, but he does not lie down again. He must grapple with the daily mystery. The iron bed fastened to the wall, the shelf fastened to the wall, the wooden chair fastened to the wall by a chain, this chain residue of a very ancient order, in which prisons were called keeps and dungeons, in which prisoners, like sailors, were galley slaves, dims the modern cell with a romantic Brest or Toulon fog, carries it back through time, and makes darling shudder subtly at the suspicion that he is in the Bastille. The chain is a symbol of a monstrous power, weighted with a ball. It used to shackle the numb feet of His Majesty's galley slaves. The dry kelp mattress, narrow as the bier of an oriental queen, the bare hanging bulb, are as rigid as a precept, as bones and exposed teeth. When he returns home, to the attic, darling will never again, if he sits or lies down or has tea, be able to forget that he is resting or sleeping on the framework of an armchair or sofa. The iron hand in the velvet glove is a reminder. Let the veil be lifted. Alone in the cell, in almost breast-like rhythm, it beats like a mouth. The white tile latrine gives its comforting breath. It alone is human.